The Great Hall of Zyrrak Prime was unlike anything Captain Ray Carter had ever seen. Towering obsidian pillars reached for a ceiling lost in darkness, their surfaces etched with glowing crimson symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. A deep, steady hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor beneath his boots. He wasn't sure if it was some kind of energy field or simply the weight of 1,000 alien eyes staring at him. He stood at the center of the chamber, feeling painfully human amid the towering, armored forms of the Zyrrak elite. Their polished exoskeletons gleamed under the eerie red glow of the chamber, their slit-like eyes locked onto him with something between curiosity and quiet menace. The air was thick with tension, and though he kept his face neutral, his instincts screamed at him. This was not a diplomatic meeting. This was a test. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne carved from the bones of some long-extinct beast, was Queen Xal'vora. Her presence was overwhelming. Unlike her warriors, she wore no armor, only a flowing robe of deep violet, its fabric shifting as if alive. Her skin was smooth, a dark metallic sheen, and her eyes burned like molten gold. She did not need to move, did not need to raise her voice. She ruled with presence alone. Ray had dealt with alien leaders before. He had seen warlords, kings, and tyrants. But there was something about her, a cold certainty, a mind that had already decided something before he had even entered the room. Captain Ray Carter of Earth, you stand before the Zyrrak throne. Her voice was smooth, measured, but it carried the weight of command. No translator was needed. The Zyrrak had long mastered the art of language absorption, and she spoke English with unsettling perfection. He inclined his head slightly. I am honored, Your Majesty. She did not return the gesture. Her golden eyes studied him like a predator considering its prey. I have called you here for a matter of great importance. The war between our species was avoided, but peace is fragile. Treaties can be broken. Words are easily forgotten. Ray kept his breathing steady. He had been briefed before arriving. This was supposed to be a routine diplomatic engagement, a show of good faith, nothing more. Yet every instinct told him this was anything but routine. The Queen's gaze hardened. There is only one way to ensure true unity between our people. A slow, deliberate pause. Then she spoke the words that shattered everything. A human must marry my daughter. Silence fell over the chamber. The hum in the air, the breathing of the assembled warriors, even the flickering flames along the walls. Everything seemed to freeze. Ray felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. For the first time, he was certain he had misheard. Surely he had misheard. He cleared his throat, careful to keep his voice level. Your Majesty, I don't believe our governments have discussed such an arrangement. She did not blink. They will, or there will be no peace. The words landed like a hammer. Ray knew that Earth's fragile alliance with the Zyrrak was built on mutual necessity. Humanity had proven themselves capable of resisting Zyrrak aggression, but a full-scale war would be disastrous for both sides. They had reached a delicate balance, one that could collapse at the slightest provocation. And now, she was holding that balance hostage. The princess. Ray started carefully, choosing his words like a man navigating a minefield. Does she agree to this? For the first time, the Queen's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Her wishes are irrelevant. She understands her duty. A sharp clang echoed through the hall as a door behind the throne slid open. From the shadows stepped Princess Vel'na. She was taller than him by at least a foot, her lithe frame wrapped in a flowing deep blue cloak that barely concealed the bio-armor beneath. Her face was regal, her sharp features alien yet undeniably striking. But it was her eyes that unsettled him, cold, piercing, assessing. The gaze of someone who had already accepted her fate long before he had even arrived. She approached slowly, each step deliberate. When she finally stopped before him, her head tilted slightly, as if sizing him up. Then she spoke, her voice sharp and controlled. Do not think this is for love, human. This is for survival. The words sent a chill down Ray's spine. Queen Xal'vora's voice rang out once more, final and absolute. You have 3 days to decide. Refuse, and war will follow. Ray could feel the eyes of every Zyrrak warrior in the chamber locked onto him, waiting. He had come here as a diplomat, a negotiator. Now he was something else entirely. The silence stretched long after the Queen's decree. The weight of her words pressed down on Ray like an iron shackle, tightening around his throat with each passing second. The gathered Zyrrak warriors remained still, their glowing eyes locked onto him like predators waiting for the weakest in the herd to stumble. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the very air had frozen around him, suffocating in its intensity. Ray's mind raced. This wasn't a request. This wasn't a proposal open for negotiation. It was an ultimatum. 3 days to decide whether to become a political pawn in an alien empire's game, or to reject the offer and risk plunging humanity into a war it could not afford. The Queen had left no room for argument. The way she spoke, the way she had brought out Princess Vel'na, as if displaying a rare artifact, it was all carefully constructed. This wasn't some impulsive decision. This had been planned. The thought made his skin crawl. Vel'na stood before him, her expression unreadable. She neither looked pleased nor angry, just resigned, like someone who had seen the path ahead of her and decided there was no point in resisting it. Her eyes flickered over him, dissecting him the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and sharp. You are taking too long to answer. Ray exhaled slowly, trying to keep his emotions in check. Forgive me if I don't immediately accept a forced marriage. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed her face before she turned away, folding her arms. Then leave. Return to your people, but do not expect peace to follow. The words were cold, final. She wasn't threatening him. She was simply stating a fact. The Queen rose from her throne with an eerie grace, her robe shifting like liquid metal around her. You will have quarters prepared for your stay. My guards will escort you. Her golden eyes seemed to pierce through him. Use your time wisely. Without waiting for a response, she turned and disappeared into the towering shadows of the throne room, her attendants following like silent wraiths. The moment she was gone, the room seemed to release a breath it had been holding. The Zyrrak warriors finally shifted, some murmuring in their guttural tongue, casting unreadable glances toward Ray before departing. Ray remained still, his pulse still hammering against his ribs. 3 days. He had 3 days to decide whether he was willing to become a political hostage or risk war. A war that humanity might not survive. The room they had given him was nothing like the opulence of the throne chamber. The walls were smooth black metal, pulsing faintly with lines of red energy, and the ceiling was high and arched like the ribs of some great beast. There were no decorations, no furniture aside from a single metallic table and a bed that looked more like an examination slab. There were no windows, and there was only one door, locked from the outside. Ray let out a humorless chuckle. A guest, more like a prisoner. He sat down at the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. Every part of his military training told him that this was a trap, that he had been maneuvered into a situation with no good outcome. He had spent years negotiating treaties, navigating the delicate balance of diplomacy, but never had he been placed in such an impossible position. A marriage, that wasn't diplomacy. That was something ancient, something medieval, something that bound bloodlines, not governments. And yet, could he truly say no? A soft chime rang from the corner of the room. Ray turned sharply as the wall shimmered, revealing a glowing holographic interface, a communication request. His heart pounded as he pressed his hand against the interface. The screen flickered, and then the familiar face of Admiral Lane filled the projection. The older man's face was tight with concern, deep lines carved into his brow. Captain, the Admiral said without preamble, we just received word from the Zyrrak delegation. What the hell is going on? Ray exhaled. It's exactly what it sounds like, sir. The Queen is demanding that a human, specifically me, marry her daughter to secure our alliance. There was a pause. Lane's jaw tightened. I assume you told her to go to hell. Ray hesitated. If I do, war follows. That was made clear. The silence on the other end stretched before the Admiral finally sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. We can't afford a war, Carter. Not now. Not with the other factions already circling us like vultures. His voice was grim. We're still recovering from the last conflict. We don't have the fleet strength for another full-scale war against the Zyrrak. Ray already knew that. The Zyrrak were stronger, more technologically advanced. They could tear Earth apart if they wanted to. But this isn't just about war, Ray said carefully. The Queen is playing a game, and I don't know what the end goal is. She wants power, Lane said flatly. That much is obvious. The question is, what kind? Ray's thoughts raced. Was this a power grab? A way for the Queen to secure human influence under her rule? Or was there something else at play? Something he hadn't seen yet. 3 days, Ray murmured. That's all I have. Lane nodded slowly. Then use them well. The screen went dark. Ray sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty projection. 3 days. 3 days to figure out the Queen's true intentions. 3 days to decide the fate of 2 species. And 3 days to determine if he would become a husband, a prisoner, or a catalyst for war. Ray Carter had spent his life making impossible decisions, but none had ever felt quite like this. He had led troops through war, brokered peace between enemies who would rather see each other burn, and sat across tables where the wrong word could mean millions of lives lost. But this was different. The Queen had laid down her demand with absolute finality. Marry her daughter, Princess Vel'na, or the fragile peace between humans and Zyrrak would shatter into war. And yet, as Ray sat in his dimly lit quarters, staring at the cold metal walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a mere political alliance. Why him? Why a human? The Zyrrak were not a species known for compromise. Their empire was built on conquest, strength, and unshakable loyalty to their hierarchy. If they wanted peace, why not demand technology, resources, or even military aid? Why demand a marriage? A soft chime echoed through the room. He looked up as the door slid open, revealing Princess Vel'na standing in the doorway. She was still clad in the deep blue cloak from before, her posture perfectly composed, her expression unreadable. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, the door sealing behind her with a quiet hiss. Ray exhaled. I take it you're not here for small talk. She tilted her head slightly. Humans talk too much when faced with an obvious choice. His lips pressed into a thin line. I don't consider being forced into a political marriage an obvious choice. Vel'na took a step closer, folding her arms. Then you are a fool. War is the only alternative. If we marry, your people live. If you refuse, they burn. There is no debate here. Ray held her gaze. And you? Do you want this? She hesitated. It was barely noticeable. Just a flicker in her eyes, the faintest shift in her stance. But he caught it. I was born into duty, she said finally. What I want does not matter. That answer told him more than she realized. Ray ran a hand over his face. There's something you're not telling me. I know a power play when I see one, and your mother is pulling something here. Vel'na's jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. He pressed on. This isn't just about peace, is it? There's another reason the Queen wants a human on the throne. She let out a slow breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, quieter. There are those among my people who do not wish to see the old ways continue, she said. My mother is one of them. She believes the Zyrrak Empire has stagnated, that we will fall into ruin if we do not adapt. Our strength has kept us alive, but it has also made us blind. Ray frowned. So this is about reform. More than that, Vel'na said. It is about survival. If our people do not change, we will collapse from within. For the first time, Ray saw something in her expression that wasn't cold calculation. It was fear. She turned away, staring at the metallic walls. The generals resist my mother's vision. They want war, not unity. They see our past conquests as proof that we are superior and that your species should bow, not bargain. She looked back at him, her golden eyes sharp. My mother believes that if a human is bound to the throne, if one of your kind becomes part of our rule, then the empire will be forced to change. Ray let out a low whistle. So that was it. The queen wasn't just trying to secure peace. She was trying to alter the very foundation of Zyrrak society. And Ray Carter had just become the linchpin of a civil war waiting to happen. He shook his head. This is insane. You're asking me to step into a political nightmare, marry someone I don't know, and somehow fix an empire that's been running on war for centuries. Vel'na's gaze hardened. I am not asking. I am telling you what is necessary. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. And what happens if I refuse? There was no hesitation this time. The generals will take control. They will declare war on humanity. Millions will die, including you. The words hung heavy in the air. Ray stared at her, searching her face for any sign of deception, but there was none. She truly believed what she was saying, and if she was right, then refusing this marriage wasn't just about his own fate. It was about the fate of his entire species. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. You don't think your mother will survive this, do you? Vel'na's jaw tightened. If the coup happens, she will be the first to fall. Ray ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. This was so much bigger than what he had been prepared for. He had thought he was walking into a diplomatic mission, not a revolution wrapped in the form of a wedding. He stopped, looking back at Vel'na. And you? If the coup happens, what happens to you? She met his gaze without flinching. They will make me a figurehead, or they will execute me. Ray swore under his breath. He had spent years making hard calls, but this wasn't just hard. This was impossible. Vel'na took a step closer. Make no mistake, human. This is not about you. It never was. You are simply a tool, a symbol. She tilted her head slightly. But tools can be powerful. And symbols can change empires. Ray let out a slow, measured breath. 3 days. 3 days to decide whether he would step into the fire and become part of a struggle that could shape the future of an entire species, or 3 days to walk away and doom humanity to war. No matter which path he chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The night was unnervingly silent. Ray Carter lay on the stiff, metallic bed in his assigned quarters, staring at the ceiling. The pulsing red energy lines that ran through the walls provided the only illumination, casting a dim glow that flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat. Sleep was impossible. His mind refused to rest. Tangled in the web of politics, war, and impossible choices laid before him. He had spent years negotiating with alien species, mediating disputes that could spiral into full-scale conflicts, but nothing had ever come close to this. A forced marriage to a Zyrrak princess wasn't just unprecedented, it was insanity. And yet, the more he unraveled the queen's motivations, the clearer it became that this was not a simple power grab. It was a desperate gamble. But desperate moves invited desperate enemies. A faint hiss broke the silence. Ray's instincts kicked in immediately. He turned his head just in time to see a sliver of motion near the door, a shadow where there should have been none. Someone was inside. Years of training took over. In a single motion, he rolled off the bed, barely avoiding the sharp edge of a blade that came down where his throat had been. The assassin moved with terrifying speed, their form shrouded in darkness, the sleek curve of their weapon barely visible in the low light. Ray didn't have a weapon. His sidearm had been confiscated the moment he set foot on Zyrrak Prime. But he had been in worse situations before. Fists and instinct would have to be enough. The assassin lunged again. Ray twisted, grabbing the attacker's arm mid-swing, forcing the blade away from his body. The assassin reacted instantly, bringing a knee up toward his ribs. Ray barely managed to block it, but the sheer strength behind the strike sent him stumbling backward. Not human. That much was clear. The assassin was Zyrrak, but not one of the Queen's elite guards. Their armor was dark, lacking the regal gold trims of the palace forces. This wasn't sanctioned. This was a hit job. The assassin wasted no time, pressing the attack. The blade came again, a series of rapid, precise strikes aimed at his vital points. Ray dodged as best he could, but the confined space of the room left him with little room to maneuver. He caught a glancing cut along his forearm, the sting sharp but manageable. He needed to turn the tide. Fast. The assassin lunged again, but this time, Ray didn't move away. Instead, he stepped into the attack, grabbing the assassin's wrist and driving his other elbow hard into their gut. The impact sent a shockwave up his arm, but it worked. The assassin staggered for just a moment. A moment was all Ray needed. With all the strength he had, he drove his fist into the side of the assassin's head. The force sent them crashing into the wall, their blade clattering to the ground. Before they could recover, Ray grabbed the weapon and held it against the attacker's throat. "Who sent you?" he demanded, breathing hard. The assassin said nothing. Their chest rose and fell rapidly, golden eyes glaring at him with cold, unwavering hatred. Ray pressed the blade closer. "Talk." Still, nothing. Then, in a blur of motion, the assassin bit down hard on something in their mouth. Ray's eyes widened as the assassin's body suddenly convulsed. Poison. He barely had time to react before the Zyrrak's eyes dimmed, their body going limp beneath him. Ray let out a harsh breath. Damn it. He stood slowly, his heart still hammering. This wasn't just a random attack. Someone wanted him dead before the marriage could happen, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to ensure it. The door to his quarters hissed open. Ray spun, blade still in hand, ready for another fight, only to find Princess Vel'na standing in the doorway, flanked by two of the Queen's elite guards. Her eyes immediately went to the corpse on the floor, then to the cut on Ray's arm, then back to his face. She exhaled through her nose. "You are more difficult to kill than I expected." Ray let out a humorless chuckle. "I get that a lot." He tossed the blade onto the ground between them. "Your people have a funny way of treating their guests." Vel'na stepped inside, motioning for the guards to secure the body. "This was not my mother's doing, nor mine." Ray crossed his arms. "Then who?" Her expression was grim. "The ones who want war." That much Ray had already figured out. He ran a hand through his hair, adrenaline still pumping through his veins. "So what now? I wake up tomorrow and find another knife at my throat." Vel'na shook her head. "Now you understand what is at stake." She took a step closer, her golden eyes locked onto his. This was not a test. This was not intimidation. This was a direct attempt on your life. If they are willing to act this boldly now, they will not stop. Ray clenched his jaw. The implications were clear. If the generals were already moving against him, then the Queen's hold on power was even more fragile than he had thought. Vel'na spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "If you refuse the marriage, they will win. They will seize control, and your people will be the first to suffer." Ray exhaled sharply. "And if I accept?" She didn't hesitate. "Then they will try again. But at least then, you will have power to fight back." His fingers curled into fists. This wasn't diplomacy. This wasn't negotiation. This was survival. And now, for the first time since stepping onto Zyrrak Prime, he truly understood the danger he was in. Ray Carter was no stranger to high-stakes diplomacy, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. He stood before Queen Xal'vora once again, but this time, the game had changed. The assassination attempt had made everything clear. There was no neutrality left, no safe ground. Someone among the Zyrrak leadership wanted him dead, And if they were willing to strike within the heart of the palace itself, then their reach was deeper than he had thought. His survival had only delayed the inevitable. The queen sat upon her throne, her golden eyes gleaming as she studied him. Vel'na stood at her side, silent but watchful. The air in the great hall was thicker than before, charged with the weight of unspoken knowledge. Ray didn't wait for pleasantries. He stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Your Majesty, I want answers." A flicker of amusement crossed the queen's face. "Do you?" He clenched his jaw. "You claimed this marriage would secure peace, that it was the only way to prevent war. But that was a lie, wasn't it?" The murmurs of the assembled Zyrrak officials ceased. A silence settled over the chamber, tense and expectant. But the queen only tilted her head, as if considering his words. Ray pressed on. "If peace was truly the goal, you wouldn't have needed to trap me in this deal. You wouldn't have had assassins waiting in the shadows to take me out the moment I became inconvenient. No, this isn't about peace at all." The queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose from her throne, her robes flowing like liquid metal as she descended the steps toward him. The guards along the perimeter stiffened, as if unsure whether her movement meant danger or revelation. Then she spoke. "You are correct, human. This is not about peace." The confirmation sent a ripple through the chamber. Ray held his ground. "Then what is it about?" The queen came to a stop a few feet from him, gazing at him with an expression he could not quite decipher. "It is about survival." Ray frowned. "Your empire is the strongest military force in this sector. The Zyrrak have ruled for centuries. Survival shouldn't be a problem." A slow, knowing smile crept onto her lips. "That is what you assume." She turned, gesturing toward the towering stained glass depiction of Zyrrak's past conquests that loomed behind her throne. "For centuries, we have expanded, crushed weaker species, taken what we needed. That is our way. Strength, above all else." Her voice darkened slightly. "But strength does not last forever." Ray narrowed his eyes. "You think the Zyrrak are weakening?" The queen exhaled. "Not yet. But they will. We are at the peak of our power, and peaks are always followed by decline." The words hung heavy in the air. Ray wasn't sure if he believed it at first. From what he had seen, the Zyrrak were powerful. Their military was unmatched, their warriors disciplined and unyielding. But power was fragile. He had seen empires fall before, not in battle, but in the quiet unraveling that followed when leaders refused to adapt. "You fear that if the Zyrrak don't change," Ray said slowly, "they'll collapse." The queen's eyes locked onto his. "Not fear. No." He felt a chill at her certainty. She continued, her tone calm but deliberate. "There are already signs. Generals who grow restless, eager for another war to keep the machine moving. Scientists who warn that our reliance on conquest is unsustainable. Internal divisions, factions forming. The cracks are appearing." Ray inhaled sharply. This wasn't just politics. This was a slow-motion catastrophe waiting to happen. The queen's voice softened, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "If we continue as we have, war will not come from your kind, Captain Carter. It will come from within." For the first time, Ray understood the true purpose behind her plan. It wasn't just about preventing war with humanity. It wasn't about maintaining the Empire's strength. It was about changing the very foundation of Zyrrak rule. And she had chosen him as the catalyst. His throat felt dry. "You're using me as a symbol. If a human marries into your ruling line, it proves to your people that change is coming, whether they like it or not." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You are perceptive, Captain." Ray shook his head. "And you really think your people will just accept this?" The queen's expression darkened. "No, that is why you were nearly killed." The weight of the situation settled over him like a crushing force. The assassins weren't trying to prevent a war. They were trying to preserve their way of life. They didn't see a marriage as a peace treaty. They saw it as the beginning of the end for the Zyrrak Empire they had built on conquest, and they would not let it happen without a fight. Ray turned to Vel'na, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "And you? Do you believe in this plan?" She met his gaze, her face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "I believe it is necessary." Ray exhaled sharply. "Even if it gets us both killed." Her expression did not change. "Especially if it gets us both killed." The words sent a chill down his spine. This was bigger than him, bigger than either of them. This was the future of an empire. And one way or another, change was coming. The palace was too quiet. Ray Carter had spent enough time in hostile territory to recognize the shift in atmosphere, that unnatural stillness that came before something went terribly wrong. The Great Hall, once alive with the steady hum of Zyrrak energy fields and the rhythmic march of armored warriors, now felt hollow. Something had changed. He stood near the war table, Vel'na at his side, a holomap of the Zyrrak capital hovering between them. The Queen had left moments earlier to attend to urgent matters, her final words echoing in Ray's mind. "Prepare yourself. Once the ceremony begins, there is no turning back." But he could feel it. The ceremony might not happen at all. Vel'na's golden eyes flicked toward the towering doors at the end of the chamber. "You feel it too." Ray nodded. "Yeah. And I don't like it." The Queen had gambled everything on this union. If she succeeded, she would force the Zyrrak to change, whether they wanted to or not. But for those who thrived under the old ways, who believed in the purity of their empire's strength, this marriage was a direct threat to their existence. Ray had survived one assassination attempt. He doubted it would be the last. The doors swung open with a loud hiss. 2 Zyrrak generals entered, their dark armor trimmed with the crimson markings of the High Command. Their movements were measured, deliberate, and there was no escort. That alone set off every alarm in Ray's mind. One of the generals, a towering brute with deep scars across his exoskeletal face, stopped a few feet away from them. His name was General Vakor, a war hero among the Zyrrak, known for his ruthless tactics and unwavering belief in Zyrrak dominance. He did not bow, did not salute. Instead, his voice came low and sharp. "The wedding will not happen, Captain Carter." Vel'na stiffened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You overstep your authority, General." Vakor's mandibles flexed, his golden eyes narrowing. "I enforce the will of our empire." Ray crossed his arms. "And I take it that means killing me." The other general, a leaner Zyrrak with a cold, calculating stare, stepped forward. "Not yet." His voice was disturbingly calm. "There is still a way to avoid bloodshed." Ray met his gaze evenly. "I'm listening." The general's mandibles twitched in something almost resembling a smirk. "Leave. Abandon this farce. We will arrange a narrative that allows you to disappear with dignity. A quiet exile." Ray didn't flinch. He had heard deals like this before. They always ended the same way. "And if I refuse?" Vakor stepped closer, his massive form radiating barely restrained violence. "Then we will remove you, publicly, violently, and this empire will remember why humans do not belong among us." The threat was crystal clear. Vel'na moved before Ray could. "You dare speak treason in the Queen's own hall." Her voice was sharp, dangerous. "You forget your place, General." Vakor turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "No, Princess. You have forgotten yours." The doors behind them burst open. A squad of heavily armed Zyrrak warriors poured in, their rifles gleaming under the crimson palace lights. Not the Queen's royal guard. These were Vakor's men. Ray's instincts screamed at him. This was a coup. Vel'na reached for the blade at her side, but before she could draw it, Vakor lunged. In a blur of motion, his clawed hand closed around her throat, lifting her off the ground like she weighed nothing. Ray reacted instantly. With a sharp pivot, he seized one of the fallen soldier's energy rifles and fired. The blue plasma bolt slammed into Vakor's shoulder, forcing him to drop Vel'na as he staggered back with a growl of pain. But the room exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Vel'na rolled to her feet, drawing her blade in a single deadly motion. Ray ducked behind the war table as plasma bolts scorched the air around him. One of the rebel warriors charged toward him, but Ray whirled, using the rifle's stock as a blunt weapon, sending the attacker sprawling. Vel'na moved like a phantom, slicing through enemies with brutal efficiency, her golden eyes burning with fury. Ray grabbed another rifle from a fallen soldier and fired blindly toward the entrance, buying himself a second to assess the battlefield. They were outnumbered. Badly. "We need to get out of here," he shouted over the chaos. Vel'na dispatched another enemy before turning to him. Agreed. Ray scanned the chamber. The main exit was blocked. The only other way out was through the eastern hall, but it led deeper into the palace. Then, a new sound shattered through the battle. Explosions. Ray's heart dropped. The city outside the palace was burning. From the tall windows above, he could see dark smoke rising from the Zyrrak capital. Fires spread across the skyline, and distant gunships zipped through the air, engaging in aerial combat. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a full-scale coup. Vakor's forces had made their move, and Ray knew, without a doubt, that the Queen was already under attack. He grabbed Vel'na's arm. "We have to get to your mother. Now." She hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of realization. "If she falls." Ray cut her off. "Then your empire falls with her." She nodded sharply. They moved as one, weaving through the chaos, cutting down enemies where they could, dodging plasma fire as they made their way toward the throne room. As they ran, Ray's mind raced. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was about survival. And in that moment, he understood his role completely. He wasn't just a political pawn anymore. He was a soldier, the leader, a survivor. And if the Zyrrak wanted war, then he would give them a war they would never forget. The palace corridors trembled as explosions rocked the city outside. Smoke billowed through shattered windows, staining the once pristine halls of Zyrrak Prime with the scent of burning metal and scorched flesh. Ray Carter ran, plasma rifle in hand, Vel'na at his side. The rhythmic pound of their boots echoed through the empty corridors, punctuated by the distant sounds of battle. They had one objective: reach the throne room. Ray knew what they would find when they got there. The Queen was under attack. The coup had already begun, and if she fell, everything. The alliance, the reforms, the future of both their species would fall with her. As they neared the central chamber, a squad of heavily armed rebels rounded the corner, their rifles raised. Ray didn't hesitate. He dropped into a slide, firing 2 quick bursts from his plasma rifle. The first shot hit one of the rebels square in the chest, sending them crashing backward. The second shot forced the others to scatter. Vel'na followed up immediately, leaping into the fray with her blade, a blur of precision and death. One of the rebels turned his weapon toward her. Ray kicked the rifle up, sending the shot wide before driving an elbow into the attacker's throat. He went down with a gurgled choke. Vel'na whirled, her blade carving through the last enemy, and just like that, the hall fell silent again. Ray panted, gripping his rifle. "They're getting closer." Vel'na wiped her blade on her forearm, golden eyes sharp. "We're running out of time." They pushed forward. When they reached the massive doors of the throne room, they found them sealed shut. Ray cursed under his breath. They locked her in. Vel'na's jaw tightened, or locked the assassins in with her. Ray didn't like either option. He inspected the massive locking mechanism, too reinforced for a quick hack, too thick to blast through. Then an idea struck him. He turned to Vel'na. "How much do you trust me?" Her expression barely flickered. "I don't." Ray smirked. "Good." He lifted his rifle and fired above the door, striking the structural seams. Vel'na caught on immediately. She grabbed a discarded plasma charge from a fallen soldier and slammed it against the weakened metal. Ray yanked her back as the blast detonated. The doors buckled inward, smoke and fire curling from the wreckage. Without hesitation, they moved inside. The scene that met them was chaos. The Queen's elite guards lay slaughtered across the marble floors. The throne room was filled with smoke and blood, and at the center of it all, Queen Xal'vora knelt on the steps of her throne, wounded but still alive. Surrounding her were 3 Zyrrak generals, Vakor among them. The massive warlord turned as they entered, his golden eyes narrowing. He raised his blade. "You should have stayed hidden, human." Ray didn't wait for him to move. He fired. Vakor twisted, the plasma bolt barely missing his head. The other generals lunged forward, engaging Vel'na in a blur of blade and blood. Ray moved to the Queen, kneeling beside her. Blood seeped from a deep wound along her side. Her breathing labored. Despite the pain, her golden eyes remained sharp. "They cannot be allowed to win," she murmured. Ray nodded, gripping his rifle. "They won't." Vakor charge. Ray dodged the first strike, rolling to the side as the warlord's massive blade clashed against the floor, sending sparks flying. Ray aimed upward and fired point-blank into Vakor's leg. The warlord staggered, roaring in pain, but not down. Ray barely had time to react before Vakor's fist smashed into his chest, sending him flying across the room. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs. Vel'na fought like a demon, but she was outnumbered. The generals pressed her back, their blades a flurry of lethal strikes. Ray gritted his teeth. No, not like this. His fingers brushed against something, one of the fallen guard's weapons, a Zyrrak shock lance. He grabbed it just as Vakor advanced again. With a grunt of effort, Ray swung the lance upward, jamming it into the warlord's exposed side. A thunderous pulse of energy erupted from the weapon. Vakor's body seized, his armor cracking apart as the surge coursed through him. Ray twisted the weapon deeper. "You want a war," he growled. "Then die like a soldier." With a final, shuddering growl, Vakor collapsed. Ray turned just in time to see Vel'na drive her blade through the last general's throat. The battle was over. Ray, breathing hard, helped the Queen to her feet. She was weak, but alive. Vel'na met his gaze. "It is done." But Ray knew it wasn't over yet. The coup had been stopped, for now. But the rebellion was larger than just these generals. He turned to the Queen. "They'll keep coming. You know that." She nodded. "Yes." Ray exhaled. "Then we send a message." He stepped forward, looking at the throne, the symbol of Zyrrak rule. He turned to Vel'na. "If this empire is going to change, it needs a leader that both sides can rally behind." Vel'na studied him carefully. "And you think that leader is me?" Ray smiled grimly. "No, I think it's us." A pause. Then, a slow smirk played at the edges of her lips. The Queen, watching, gave a slow nod. "Then let the Empire witness it." The broadcast was sent across every Zyrrak-controlled world. A single image, Vel'na and Ray standing side by side, the Queen watching from the throne. A new era had begun, and Ray Carter, the reluctant diplomat, had just become the first human ruler of an alien empire. But deep in the void, in the dark corners of the Zyrrak military, the war was far from over. Because somewhere, in the shadows, another voice whispered, "The human must fall."